All right, the Lord be with you. Well, welcome to the back, I should say, since we started this class during May, during the Easter season, and wasn't sure at that time. If you were part of that, you may remember I decided to do Jonah instead of going in exact order, but I've been trying to follow through the minor or the 12 prophets, or the minor prophets as they're called. But I wanted to get in Jonah, so I went on order. But now we'll get Obadiah today. Obadiah and Micah we're going to look at. I want to lift up the thing I'm focusing on is prophets, and this would include the major prophets, as they're sometimes called, or the long ones. You got Isaiah and Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel are all longer prophetic books. But the whole idea of them being prophets are voices of truth. And certainly there is a need for voices of truth in our time, but I thought it's helpful to look at some of these voices of truth from biblical times. And in particular, we don't necessarily you get some passages from Hosea and Amos, Jonah. I think people are familiar with the story of Jonah, and so occasionally some others, especially when there's prophecies that, like from Micah, we'll have one about, the birth of a Savior, that kind of thing. But I think to some extent, it's hard for us to keep track of all these shorter, or these 12 prophets, or the minor prophets as they're called. So, I had never taught a class on this in all my years as a pastor, so it forced me to dig into it, which was part of the thinking. Sometimes I like to teach on stuff that I know very well, like Bonhoeffer and ecological ethics and things like that, or gospel parables. But there's times it's just helpful to go after something and study it to become more familiar with it. So that brings us here. We're going to look at Obadiah first. This is the shortest book in the Hebrew Bible. I think in the New Testament, probably Philemon is probably the shortest. Is it? Yeah, I think Philemon is the shortest there. But we'll take a look at Obadiah. And the issue here seems to be accountability of nations to God, even, is being lifted up. So rather than start with a priming the pump question, I want to introduce Obadiah, and then I'm going to give you a bit of a chance at your tables to talk about question I raise at the end about what constitutes just behavior between nations. But we'll look at Obadiah first and then give you a chance to discuss that, and then we'll go on to Micah. And Micah has the famous verse about doing justice, loving kindness, and walking humbly with your God, that's a very famous. Maybe not as famous as Psalm 23 or John 3:16, but it's a well-known verse that has inspired many people and given focus to people in their lives of faith. Right, so the key verse here, and so when I put Obadiah 2, that means there's no chapters, there's just verses. So Obadiah, this is verse 2, I will surely make you least among the nations, you shall be utterly despised. And so this is talking about Edom, all right? Edom, a neighboring country of Judah. So as I said, this is the shortest book in the Hebrew Bible. The name Obadiah means servant of God. It's likely from the exilic period, when the people of Judah were that's the time of the Babylonian exile. So from 587 BC to 539 BC is the period that's often lifted up as that time of exile. So the real issue here seems to be that Edom has contributed to the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile of the Judahites. And so let me read verses 10 through 14. You can follow along if you want. But this lays out the case here really very clearly. For the slaughter and violence done to your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. On the day that you stood aside, on the day that strangers carried off his wealth, and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, you too were like one of them. But you should not have gloated over your brother on the day of his misfortune. You should not have rejoiced over the people of Judah on the day of their ruin. You should not have boasted on the day of distress. You should not have entered the gate of my people on the day of their calamity. You should not have joined in the gloating over Judah's disaster on the day of his calamity. You should not have looted his goods on the day of his calamity. You should not have stood at the crossings to cut off his fugitives. You should not have handed over his survivors on the day of distress. So there's this sense that Edom, Edom's right there, and it's not been a good neighbor to Judah. I mean, that's the implication here. And not only is kind of didn't do anything, but actually made it worse. And we'll give you a chance to talk later, but it's really interesting what's going on here with Ukraine and how some of the emotions of Ukrainians, where they're upset that Russia is treating them like nothing. Certainly not. They had some sense of kinship with the Russian people, but that hasn't been there. But there's also concern about whether the countries, the NATO nations, are they doing enough for us? Are they doing enough? And so here's Ukraine is struggling with that. So what's the relationships between nations can be very difficult and challenging. Here, the expectation is that Edom, at the very least, would not contribute to the destruction of Judah and Jerusalem. And I think, as it said, you stood aside while strangers attacked Jerusalem. You aided in the invasion of Jerusalem. And so Edom violated, the quotation here is the brotherhood between nations. We might say could be a friendship relationship too, but there's a covenant relationship here in some sense that somehow you have violated that. And then after the triumph of these Babylonian armies over Judah and Jerusalem, the people are left demoralized and humiliated. And it's even worse because of the way Edom has acted. At least this is Obadiah's prophecy, that he is leveling and arguing this is the word of the Lord to the Edomites. Also the difficulty is too, even after the exile, it was not easy even after the return, it was not easy to get going again, so to speak. And so the effort was made, but it was not an easy time, and there was a very much a struggle to survive for the people of Judah and Jerusalem, even after they returned from exile. So what are some of the truths that are shared here? In the midst of this prophetic account and this calling Edom to account, the whole theme of divine justice is lifted up here. And so there's a sense that God will intervene and punish those who contributed to the betrayal and destruction of Judah. So Obadiah, this is a prophecy saying Edom needs to pay a price for what they've done to us and their contribution to this. The theme of the day of the Lord comes up here. In fact, that's in verse 15, where it says, "For the day of the Lord is near against all the nations." That's a powerful statement. So there's a sense that will be judgment and destruction of the enemies of the people of God. So anticipating that day of the Lord when God's judgment will be enacted or inflicted. There will be victory and salvation for God's people. So even despite everything that's happened, there's this hopefulness that there will be a time of vindication and victory and salvation. But a key point here is that God's justice is visited on all nations. And so there's a sense in which all the nations are held accountable to God. There is a confidence here that God is the Lord of history and that God is able to intervene in history on behalf of God's people. And then the kingdom of the Lord is the affirmation and faith and hope that God will reign in the future. So it's a confident expression in God. What makes this difficult, so it'd be interesting, if you came to the first service, you've already heard India's sermon, where she's really wrestling with this issue based on Psalm 25. Sometimes we have this sense of God being all-powerful, and boy, at times it just seems like God is not all-powerful, because if God's all-powerful, why do some people end up suffering certain kinds of things that don't seem fair at all? So what's going on here? India, she cites Rabbi Kushner and some others, really wrestles with that question and doesn't just give an easy answer to it either in the sermon today. So that'll be a good, if you haven't heard it yet, that'll be a good sermon to hear. It was a good sermon to hear before the class, but it'll be a good sermon to hear afterwards also in light of what we're talking about today. So some significant points for us today. There's a strong affirmation here that God is actively involved in history. But how is God actively involved in history continues to be something we wrestle with. That all nations are accountable before God for their actions, which actually I find that very encouraging, that all nations are held accountable. And then it raises this question of what constitutes just behavior between nations. Tell you one quick story, and then I'll have you have a conversation at your tables. So I went to seminary in the early 80s at the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago. And in 1983, there was a big election for mayor of Chicago. There were 3 primary candidates, and Jane Byrne and Richard Daley, not the Richard Daley that's of 1968 fame, but his son was running, and then a guy named Harold Washington, an African American. And they literally split the vote almost exactly in three ways, and that allowed Harold Washington to win the Democratic primary. And before we had the primary election there, back then we'd sort of talk about God being involved in our daily lives and in history and so on, but it was like we didn't really believe it, as Lutherans. We didn't really think God was actively involved, and certainly not in a political election. You just didn't think that way. Well, we had February is African American month, Black History Month, and so we had a series of African American preachers come to chapel, one a week for 4 weeks. And one of the guys that came was Jeremiah Wright. You may remember his name, because from, the Obamas went to the church that he went to. Well, he was a preacher, and he was just getting started at that same congregation there in Chicago. And he came, and he started with the Exodus, and he started down low. And he just started preaching and telling the story of the Exodus and the people of God and God working with the people. And by the time he was done, there was no question that God was right in the thick of everything there in Chicago that was going on, and he was, and it was compelling to hear how he preached. That's a tricky one, because we sometimes just have a hard time with the idea of God getting mixed up in politics and that kind of thing. But it was very clear, and that was not unusual in the African American community, to really have a strong sense of God being actively involved in history and the stuff of life. That was almost just a given in there. And then how do you work with that and understand it, and why you look at the mistreatment, well, that's too low, soft a term, the abuse that African Americans, the history of treatment of African Americans in this country, and yet there's still that powerful sense that he was conveying, and others too, that God is actively involved. Well, let's take about 5 minutes again, just to give you a chance to process a bit. And so when it comes to just behavior between nations, what to each his or her due? What is the kind of behavior or actions that are expected in the relationships of nations? And let's give you a chance to talk about that. And I don't know if you guys may want to join them. And feel free to talk about now, what's going on now too, if that's helpful to you. Just give you another minute. Yeah. I overheard you, Janet. It's Reinhold Niebuhr's book. Yeah, I had to write a complete summary of the book back in college. Yeah, but it's a classic one, which it's one of those things where it's helpful, but then if you push it too far, it doesn't always work. But he was very much, he had more confidence in individuals being able to do things than All right, let's continue. By the way, something obvious, you may be wondering, why are Edom and Judah so close? Well, the tradition was that Edom was associated with Esau and Judah with Jacob. And what's striking here is Obadiah takes that to lifting up this whole notion of the brotherhood of nations, as the principle that Obadiah is lifting up. But that was part of the tradition and why they thought of as brother nations, so to speak. And you can imagine why. Now, if you wanted to go back to seeking revenge, I would think Edom would have more of a reason, because Jacob's the one that stole the birthright. So, yeah. So if you want to hold a grudge, maybe Edom had the reason to hold the grudge there. But anyway, that was part of the tradition. Well, let's move on to Micah then. Micah's on the back of the sheet. I have some notes about that. And with Micah, start with this classic verse. In fact, we don't memorize like they did back whenever. Some of these rabbis and people would really memorize a lot of verses. And I even think memorization was more part of confirmation back. There was a time, some of you may have done more memorization and confirmation than we require at all from our students. But if you were going to pick out, maybe your top 5 verses, there'd be a lot of people that would end up with this as one of their top 5 verses. It's just a classic verse. And when it says, also just to draw a connection with something India mentions in her sermon today, where it talks about doing justice, we understand that concept, although there's a lot we can say about it. But when it talks about loving kindness, the Hebrew word there is chesed. And so it's sometimes translated as steadfast love, mercy. In the New Testament, even the word grace is related to that, but that's where that comes from, and then, to walk humbly with your God. So Micah prophesied in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. It says that right early on in the book. And that's the periods about 759 to 687 BCE. So basically it is near the end of the 8th century and then into the 7th century before the Common Era. And there's a lot of stuff happening. And during that time, you had the fall of Samaria in 722, which Samaria was the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. So if you think of the 12 tribes of Israel, the northern 10 tribes, that was the northern kingdom, and Samaria was the capital of that. Jerusalem was the capital of the southern kingdom. And then when Samaria fell, not surprising, you would have refugees or people that would want to leave, did not want to be under the Assyrians, and so a lot of these people came to Jerusalem from the north, and so you can imagine there were a lot more people then in Jerusalem. And the international situation was unstable. Apparently Assyria, was a pretty aggressive superpower. Doesn't some of this stuff just sound so familiar? It's just they didn't have as big of weapons as we did, fortunately, back then. But some of this sounds so familiar to what we're seeing in our own time. Now, Micah was from a small town southwest of Jerusalem, from Moresheth Gath. It's just interesting. Amos was from a small town in the southern kingdom too, so it's interesting that we have these prophets that are from from that area. There is a strong indictment here. Notice Obadiah basically doesn't take the leaders of Judah to task. He takes Edom to task. Here, Micah issues an indictment of the leaders. So let me just read that for you. This is, and if you want, you can take a look at it. It's chapter 3, verse 11. It says, its rulers give judgment for a bribe. Its priests teach for a price. That was getting a little too close to home when I read that. Its prophets give oracles for money. Yet they lean upon the Lord and say, surely the Lord is with us. No harm shall come upon us. So just this sense of confidence, but the rulers give judgment for a bribe. You can just buy them off. And then the priests teach for a price. The implication there is, I'm hoping, you hope when you're a pastor your motivations are solid while you're doing what you're doing. But the implication here is it's a way for them to get money. So that's why that's the primary driving motivation here. And then the prophets, same thing, give oracles for money. So the motivation of the leaders is really indicted here.
The priests too would have had they have a system in place for the priest's livelihood to be taken care of.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just the priests surviving on that money.
Yeah.
It was them looking for extra.
Okay, good clarification, yes. I'm feeling better now. Thanks, Kyler, I appreciate the thoughtfulness there. So, and then and notice the confidence, and the other part of this is these leaders just don't get it. They're just confident the Lord is with them and no harm will come upon them. And certainly we've seen that amongst leaders. I think we're more aware of it often with political leaders, but religious leaders too can fall into this kind of thinking, just so sure that we're on the right side, that God is with us, and but at times it can become the motives of what people are up to. You have to look at the consequences, but we also have to look, what are the motives of the people who are proclaiming the word? And one of the classic questions for prophets was, how do you tell a true prophet from a false prophet? Many claim to be preaching the word of the Lord or proclaiming the word of God, but who's actually doing it, and how do you test that? I think for Micah, it's very clear, if somehow this doesn't lead to justice and kindness and humility, then it's not from God. That's the basic argument that I see emerge here in Micah. So the truths that are shared, Micah goes back and forth between messages of judgment and messages of hope. So you've got both. Remember, we looked at Amos, and Amos is just like nonstop judgment. He just takes these leaders that are lining their pockets, the wealthy and so on, and just goes after them and never stops until the final chapter, basically. With Micah, there's more of a back and forth movement in it when you read it through, and I'd encourage you to just read through these books, even if you haven't done it yet. Just go ahead and do it, and you've got some notes here that'll help with that. But just see how Micah moves back and forth between prophecies. The prophet laments. That's clearly one of the motivations here. So in Micah 1:8, it goes, for this I will lament and wail. I will go barefoot and naked. I will make lamentation like the jackals and mourning like the ostriches. Lift that up too, because India is dealing with Psalm 25 and the whole notion of lament today in the sermon. So that's something to pay attention to also as you listen to what she has to share today. And then I want to read 1 through 7 also for you, because this is where there's a lament for the society as a whole. Woe is me, for I have become like one who, after the summer fruit has been gathered, after the vintage has been gleaned, finds no cluster to eat. There is no first ripe fig for which I hunger. The faithful have disappeared from the land, and there is no one left who is upright. They all lie in wait for blood, and they hunt each other with nets. Their hands are skilled to do evil. The official and the judge ask for a bribe, and the powerful dictate what they desire. Thus they pervert justice. The best of them is like a briar, the most upright of them a thorn hedge. The day of their sentinels, of their punishment has come. Now their confusion is at hand. Put no trust in a friend. Have no confidence in a loved one. Guard the doors of your mouth from her who lies in your embrace. For the son treats the father with contempt. The daughter rises up against her mother. The daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. Your enemies are members of your own household. But as for me, I will look to the Lord. I will wait for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me. Just that series of 7 verses is kind of a classic lament where you start with a lament, and then usually in the classic lament there is some statement of hope toward the end. So this in effect is almost like, and the Psalms are full of these laments. But just the no trust. There's no trust in a friend, have no confidence in a loved one. We've been experiencing some of that in our culture, even more intensively in these most recent years than we have, at least in my lifetime, this in terms of lack of trust, lack of confidence, more pronounced now than anything I've experienced. Now I realize I'm, different age than I was during the Vietnam War years and so on, but it just seems like this is really an issue now. And in some ways it got started with Watergate, Richard Nixon, although actually the Pentagon Papers during Vietnam, so I'm not saying this is brand new. It just feels, it's kind of like the ground is moving under our feet. The ground's, and the ability to trust and have confidence in people. It's a difficult time from that standpoint, and Mike is talking about that here in sharing this prophecy from God. The prophet's message is not necessarily welcomed, so in 2:6, let me just read that for you also. 2:6, do not preach, thus they preach. No one should preach of such things. Disgrace will not overtake us. So they don't, and the prophets were not necessarily welcome. And again, we've seen this, the voices of truth don't always get listened to in our time either. And one of the challenges is, in terms of the church, is what we preach and teach. There's a tendency sometimes to temper what we say in the church because we're afraid of offending people, and some of that is just good common sense, but some of it may be too that we don't want to deal with potential conflict, and so we can back off, and that's in the long run. I would assume that's a loss to the people of God when we don't have truth tellers in our midst that are willing to say what's actually the case, and certainly in a nation then too, and in our world. I know there's nobody that's just going to fix things, but boy, does it feel like we need a Mandela-type leader or somebody like that right now. Just somebody that we trust and that can speak with integrity and do it in a compelling way. I'm not saying there aren't people out there, but in terms of somebody that we are listening to, too. It's not just that there people can say the truth, but whether, for whatever reasons, will we listen to what they have to say. Swords into plowshares, classic verse. We find it in Isaiah 2:4, but it's also here in Micah, so it's another somewhat well-known verse. Let me just read that for you also. He shall judge between many peoples and shall arbitrate between strong nations far away. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Classic text. There's confidence that new David shall arise from Bethlehem who will establish peace. And I put the Hebrew word shalom, so peace isn't just the absence of violence, it's well-being of the person, well-being in the community, well-being in the nations, and so on. So that's in 5:2-5, and this may, but you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, who are one of the little clans of Judah, from you shall come forth from you one who is to rule in Israel, whose origin is from of old, from ancient days. Therefore ye shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor has brought forth. Then the rest of his kindred shall return to the people of Israel, and he shall stand and feed his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they shall live secure, for now he shall be great to the ends of earth, and he shall be one of peace. Again, shalom. Think shalom, a vision of peace here. So amongst followers of Jesus, there's a sense that Jesus is the one That's why this is one of the texts connected with Christmas, where Jesus fulfills this prophecy, and that Jesus is the one of peace. And then, the final one I note here, people of God are to practice justice, mercy, and humility. So we might identify that verse identifies some core values to live by for the people of God. And I also would like to point out, sometimes we act as if, Christians have discovered all these new things. Well, we've discovered some new things, but the fact is that these core values are there in what we call the Old Testament, but in the Hebrew Bible. And Jesus really came not to change those core values, but to fulfill them and to show us what it means to live them out. And so in his life and teachings, we see that. All right, some significance for today. So true prophets speak both judgment and hope. There is a need to lament what is happening in our society. So sometimes I think we shy away from doing that, but certainly lamenting. And lamenting isn't just complaining, but it's part of it. Lament can take a lot of different forms, but it's expressing sorrow, sadness, what's the word, ire. How can this be happening? All of that is appropriate, and the psalmists were not afraid, and prophets to share whatever was on their hearts and minds. And certainly in the Psalms, you have all these prayers to God, hymns to God, not afraid to share that. Prophetic messages are not necessarily welcome, so just because you may see something and you think you're onto something and you speak it out, it may not be welcomed at all. In fact, it's not surprising to prophets. Being a prophet wasn't necessarily well, it could be dangerous at times, obviously. So telling the truth is not doesn't always just mean you're going to get welcomed for telling the truth. So you really have to have to be a strong core there for us to speak out in tough times. And this applies not just when you're speaking to nations or to the people of God, but what does it mean to do that in our personal relationships? It can be really hard to do in our personal relationships, to tell the truth to somebody, even a loved one, because it can be very, very hard, and there can be conflict. God is intent on establishing peace in our world, peace in the fullest sense of the term. Shalom is the Hebrew word again there. Our core values and practices include justice, mercy, and humility. Mercy is that kindness, steadfast love. The chesed is the key term. And in tumultuous times, it is especially important to focus on our core values and practices. In times like these, we need to be especially dialed in and focused on our core values, because it's hard to kind of find our way during tumultuous times, and so we really have to be rooted in those core values. Wanted to have a chance. Let's just speak. If you have anything to share, let's just do it as a group here. And you know what I'm going to do? I'll put on my mask, but I'm going to come around and give you the microphone so that it can get recorded, anything you're willing to say. So you are being recorded if you speak on the microphone. But don't be afraid. Think of what these prophets had to do. So this is a pretty mild group here. Anybody got a comment or a question?
I just wanted to make a quick comment on lamentation. For when I think of a lament, I think of a necessary purpose of it as acknowledging what's happening, acknowledging the injustice, so then we can address it.
Yeah, that's a good way to talk. That's a helpful way to talk about it, Scott. Acknowledging.
I have just a quick story. So I grew up Romanian Pentecostal, and some of the leaders in the church were quite corrupt. And I remember being little and having these older women in the congregation be considered prophets, and they would literally get up during the preacher's sermon and prophesy against them and spill their dirty laundry to the whole church. And that was quite common growing up. So yeah, I just thought you'd be grateful that
We're so much more well-behaved. But that's interesting. Notice how that's being, sometimes some things might not have gotten exposed, because we have people that have done corrupt things in the Lutheran Church and done it under the radar screen too, so.
Another thing I thought was interesting is in our Bible, the lament I guess it was part of the lamentation, but where he goes after the rulers, right? In chapter 7, if you look in the footnotes, a couple of times where he says their hands are skilled to do evil, or the day of their sentinels, of their punishment. It says, the Hebrew actually says your. So, and I think, because you talk about speaking the truth and potentially sometimes we shy away from it to avoid conflict or things like this. Mike is not just saying about them, he's actually saying your. I mean, he's writing right to these people that he's criticizing, and I think that, maybe that was a translation decision because of how we tend to use our scriptures, and that could be dangerous for us to have that language, but it's definitely, if you look at it, it speaks more to his intention and his directness, his boldness even, with what he's writing.
Anybody else? Anything you want to share? A story? Fran?
Seems like a lot of the scriptures, and including Micah, talk about the rich class and the very poor, and they're not sharing, and they were saying corrupt merchants and people losing their houses and their fields because of unethical behavior on some of those leaders in control and the wealthy. And how is that different than today?
And Amos is another one who just went after the wealthy, and even he's, it's a little hard to get, but he talks about how they're literally making the way they weighed crops and stuff like that. They just had ways of making sure that people got paid less than they deserve for their crops and so on, which went on during slavery, or even after the end of slavery. But then when they would go and raise their crops and then bring them in, they got cheated out of fair wage. And sometimes we are not fair right out in front of everybody too. It's not like we hide it even. But that is a strong prophetic theme, is the rich taking advantage of the poor.
Dust Bowl and some of those songs about my own myself to the company store, and
Yeah.
some of these
Oh, yeah,
things we're doing in our ladies group, and indeed that was going on.
Yeah, companies, yeah, no, that's right. Anybody else? Comment or question? Last comment or question? It looks like we're just about to time. All right, well, thank you. Let me just give you an idea. So we're going to do things in proper order now. So it'll be Nahum, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah next week. So we've done 6 of the 12 prophets, and if you look in your Bible, you don't have to even remember this. You want to read the 7th through the 9th of those 12 prophets if you want to read ahead. But I do encourage you to read, read these books through, and many of them are fairly short, but even Micah's a little longer. Zephaniah, there are a couple of them that are a little longer, but I think it's worth just reading through so we have some familiarity with them. Thank you, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Go in peace.